Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I must say I'm reminded a little bit of the first day of school when I got up to teach, which I conveniently forgot about after all these years, but pleasantly reminded. So I am Rabbi Barry Chesler. I teach at the Schechter School of Long Island. I've been there 21 years. You can see my academic credentials. I also have taught at Camp Ramah in the Berkshires. In fact, I just came yesterday, driving 6 hours after Mincha. And I've also taught at the Pro-Story High School, the Jewish Theological Seminary. So the focus of this session is how to create student ownership in the study of Jewish texts. So what I've noticed over the years is that there's been a shift in the student population. Years ago, I could give kids a text and a jastro, since I taught mostly rabbinics, and they would sit down and do the best that they could with it. And even students who were not as adept in Hebrew or text study would sit and do what they could with it until we gathered together to discuss the text. That is no longer the case. And I was reminded of this again yesterday. I was talking to the oldest campers about the meaning of Tisha B'Av, and these are kids going into 11th grade, and they feel totally disconnected from Tisha B'Av, number one, which is, I suppose, a chaval, but also they notice that they're different from a previous generation, that they think that their disconnectedness is something new. And so I suspect that there is something new in the student population, and that what's worked in the past isn't going to work anymore. At the same time, we have technology. So at my school, a few years ago, they mandated that everyone needs to have a device in school, a cell phone or a computer. I don't know if it was the wisest decision that was ever made, which came to the fore the very first day of school when the network was down, and all these teachers who had prepared online material had no access to it. But this is life in the 21st century. I was working very hard with both Juan and Roman to get my presentation in order. We had innumerable technological difficulties, not all of which were resolved. But the piece of technology that affects us is that nowadays there are lots of English translations online for virtually every Jewish text. And there are so many that there are even ones that you could tell students not to use because they're not as good as others. And last year I had to substitute for one of the teachers out for medical leave. And it happened to be a class that one of my sons was in. And these were the best students, many of them. And the first thing they do when you give them a text is open up Safari. And they're completely unembarrassed about it. And so the idea of traditional text study is perhaps no longer as engaging for students as it was when I first started teaching over 20 years ago. So I began my journey with BetterLesson 2 years ago. Use Seesaw. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but it's an online portfolio, which is a good way to ask questions and get quick answers from students. I happen to have some organizational problems, so it's very easy to have stuff online and not have to worry about where I put the papers. And it also allowed me to write a quick note to students as well. To a lesser extent, I use the choice board, but this past year I used Carousel, Bloom's Taxonomy, sentence stems, Socratic dialogue, and Fishbowl to promote engagement. So the first thing you notice is that 4 or 5 techniques looking for something that would work, and that would work well. Not surprisingly, one stops when one gets to what one thinks that works well, so the Socratic dialogue and the Fishbowl were the ones that seemed to work the best in my field. So the Socratic seminar, just briefly if you're not familiar with it, is a student-led discussion based on previously answered questions, which could be assigned as either classwork or homework. And the teacher has no formal role. My role during most of the time, because it was through BetterLesson, was to film it so I could send it to my coach. It requires some rules clarification, how long people should spend on each question, as well as special roles, a student leader and a timekeeper. All that can be assigned in advance. And then the students, as you can see here, this was not my class. The previous technical difficulties alluded to explain why. Suggest that the students sit in a circle, and you could have one person in the middle as one of the variations. And the student leader begins and conducts the discussion however he or she wishes to do so. All the ones that I did, I used it both in 9th, 10th, and 12th grade. The student leaders all did, I thought, quite well. And they all have their own styles. Some students talked more than others did. Others allowed students to answer more of the questions, and the discussion moved along at an appropriate pace. The fishbowl. So the fishbowl is a variation of the Socratic seminars. So you divide the class into two. You have an inner circle and an outer circle. The inner circle is the one that conducts the discussion, and the outer circle are observers. So what's important with observers is that they have an assignment as well. You often think of Settlers of Catan, which is a great board game, in part because it gives everyone something to do every single turn. Most board games, the person rolls the dice and they move and everyone sits around uninvolved, but Settlers of Catan, you have to be involved every game. So in this particular version, the fishbowl, you give the kids on the outside an assignment. They have to track their partner. So obviously it works better if there's an even number of students, but it can work with an odd number as well. So they have to note how they might have responded differently to the question that was asked. So the way I did it is everyone got the same set of questions. One group would answer half the questions, say, and the second group would then answer the other questions. So everyone has their own answer to each of the questions. You could figure out what you might have done differently. There are other assignments that you could give afterwards. You can match them up, have them process how the situation worked for them, and it could be very effective. Surprisingly, everyone participates in the fishbowl, not immediately. But the thing that I noticed is that because I have no role, I could watch the kids who are less likely to participate. Sometimes I encourage the student leader to call on that person. And because everyone has already written out answers to the questions, they actually have something they can say. It's not quite putting a kid on a spot. When you cold call a student, they may not have done the assignment. Here, everyone did the assignment, and it could be checked in advance to make sure, but in my case, everyone had done the assignment in advance. And it allows everyone to participate, and I think it improves self-esteem because even kids who are reluctant to talk have something to say that can be validated both by the teacher and by their fellow students. The level of discussion also increases, I think, because the students are actually talking to each other. And one of the tendencies, certainly in my classes, is for everything to be filtered through me. It's easy as a teacher to stand in the room and want to be the center of attention. Sometimes I actually give way to that as well. But it's much better if the students are actually talking to each other and have something to say to each other. And so both the Socratic seminar and the fishbowl allow these things to take place in a way that I think works best for almost all the students that I've had. I found, not surprisingly perhaps, that the Socratic seminar and fishbowl worked better in 12th grade than it did in 9th and 10th grade. In 12th grade, the kids are older, obviously. They think better, and they discuss better. So what that means is that 9th and 10th grade needs more work on the teacher's part, which is something that I will be working on in the coming year. I mentioned earlier Bloom's taxonomy and the talk stems. So these are ways to engage the younger students in thinking about what kinds of questions lend themselves to better discussion than others. I think there's a tendency among a lot of teachers, and again, I include myself, to rely a lot on fact-based answers and one-word answers. I remember very early on in my career, one of my mentors telling me never to ask a question that could be answered in one word, and 20 years later, it's still sometimes hard to do. But if the students can be trained to think about what kinds of questions are appropriate for a given text, I think Bloom's taxonomy and the talk stems are valuable tools in that regard. So what I did in that way is I handed out Bloom's taxonomy. I think I have a picture of it somewhere. Maybe not. I handed out Bloom's taxonomy, and on a given text, they had to come up with 10 questions. So obviously, they had to use each of the 6 domains of the questions. And in this way, the students can be trained to think about what kinds of questions lend themselves to better discussion than other questions. So This was a picture of the fishbowl in my 9th grade class. You could see the 2 circles. This was a very small class. There were only 10 kids in this class, so there were 5 on the inside, 5 on the outside. In my 10th grade class, I only had 8, and I tried it there as well. As I said, it has its advantages, and it's something certainly worth trying. So apparently I talk a lot faster than I think. Does anyone have any questions? If you don't, then I have an exercise we could try. So there's a link here to Samuel 11 and 12. This is a text that I teach in 12th grade Bible. It's a story of David and Bathsheba. The reason why it's in 12th grade Bible is for the purposes of comparing it to the lack of a story in Chronicles, which is the subject of 12th grade Bible, Second Temple Judaism. And it's a story that most of the kids know, even though they may not have studied it previously or remembered it. In our school, Samuel was kind of beaten to death in middle school. They spend 2 or sometimes 3 years studying the book of Samuel. I never quite figured out why that was the case, but it is what it is. So if you open the link, you can read the 2 chapters. These are the questions I actually gave my students, and we could try and model a fishbowl with your indulgence. So has everyone had a chance to work through most of the story? So if we could just face each other, perhaps would be the best. That will be our compromise circle. And if someone would take the role of leader and ask the question and see what kind of answers we get. And part of the key here was that they had to find textual support. So what I did actually was have them submit their answers in writing to me, which receives a separate grade. And that way the kid who didn't participate in this particular assignment got a grade.
But also increase their confidence in class.
One hope, yeah. I think so. And the next one, I made sure that he called on and he had something intelligent to say. And which was important because he was a student who works a lot with a tutor, both in and out of the school. So he was able to participate in the conversation and yeah.
I just wanted to know if you grade student participation in the fishbowl or the Socratic seminar, or it's just kind of like a classroom expectation.
So it depends. I think the goal originally was to give them a grade, but I always have the problem that if there's a participation grade and someone doesn't participate, what do you do with that? It doesn't seem right to give them a 0 because they're in the class, which seems to be minimum participation. Also, on one hand, I tend to be a hard grader, but I don't like to punish kids for things that seem not worth punishing them for. So in this particular one, I graded the written work, and I didn't give the kid a 0, but I gave him a lower grade for lack of participation, but it wasn't that much lower. I've always found this difficult. There are kids who never participate in my classes, even though the participation rate ranges from 10 to 20% of the course grade, of the class grade, the quarter grade. And there are kids who would have an A+ except for the fact that they never opened their mouth. And it seems unfair to punish them because their work is obviously top quality if they get an A+ on everything except for opening their mouth. So as I get older, I'm less punitive, and I try and ask myself what really is the best for the student, which rarely, I think, is giving them a 0 on anything. Oh, well, that's the alarm, so it's time to talk. Yeah.
The people on the outside of the fishbowl, can you just explain more, like what's so...
So they have a pair. They're paired with someone on the inside of the circle. So that person's going to answer a question, and the person on the outside has to be able to respond to that in writing. Either say that this was good, maybe I have a different text that could support this. Maybe you should have thought of this.
So they're giving feedback, kind of?
Well, not immediately. They're just writing down so that they have some way of participating while they're not talking. Because the rule is that you can only talk if you're on the inside.
Okay, yeah. And the other thing, like I teach elementary, but I did like literature circles this year, and participation again was like, so I gave them, like it's not the same as fishbowl, but it was a circle, and I gave them guiding questions, but I kind of tried to like tell them like our goal is to have everybody participate, because I noticed there was dominators, obviously.
Right.
They love to talk and dominate the conversation. They wanted participation points, and so I kind of taught them to like encourage others to participate, but not in like a way that's like, come on, but it would be like, Tracy, what do you think? Like, because they were trying to like almost like help her a little bit.
Sure.
I don't know like what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean,
that.
there are always kids who want to talk.
Yeah.
Sometimes what I find is that when the student is leading the discussion, they're more apt not to call out or to respond to the student saying, you have to wait your turn, than the teacher. But as I said, I think the older you get, the better kids discuss. So it's just, you know, anything that gets kids to talk, I think, is desirable. Any other questions? So if we could just, and I'd be curious what your answers are to any of these questions, and for someone to respond. So you had the phone, so you get to read the question.
To read the question?
Yeah, read the question and call on someone to answer.
For the following questions, find textual support at least 2 to 3 verses for your answer. You will be participating in a student-led discussion on Monday.
Okay, so today's Monday, so we'll.
For men, which one best exemplifies his role? David is a king, Joab is general, Uriah is husband and soldier, Nathan is prophet. What, should I continue?
Well, call on someone to answer.
That's not nice. Melanie, what do you think?
Oh, man, the print is way too small for me.
My
but-
apologies.
No, that's not your fault.
Well, I chose the font.
Okay.
I'm wondering if verse 18, I think, so, there was like something that kind of gives it an example that Uriah, that Joab was a general.
Yeah. So
I can't see it.
Yeah, Joab sent and told David all the things concerning the war, so he was able to do his job.
Okay. Well, no, call on someone else.
Me, yeah.
Yeah, you're the
Oh,
leader.
okay. Oh, I am the leader.
I'm helping.
There we go.
I think that it was David who actually exemplifies himself best as a king, because he is the one who, throughout the entire text, is giving orders. Some of them are ethical orders, some of them are less ethical orders, but they are definitely orders that he is giving as the king, and he wants to get what he wants to get.
Okay, so here I would interject. So what do you make of the beginning of the story? Where is David?
David is on the rooftop.
Okay, and where is his army?
They're out in the field.
So the king is supposed to be with the army, not on the rooftop.
Yeah.
So the question is he acting as the king then? Or is this a real arrogant form of royal prerogative where you send the men to fight while I sleep with the generals?
Do you want my answer? Do you want
Sure.
Gemara's answer? The Gemara
I want
answer
your-
is that he didn't
it's a
sing at all.
Well, I want your answer. Pretend you're in 12th grade.
This is a very difficult text for an adult as well as a 12th grader, because on the outside, even though we know that the Gemara says that David did not sin, it looks like there's a real problem here.
Right.
Well,
Well, certainly Mariah. Well, that's what attracted him in the first place, was Mariah. Okay, so why don't we try another question? Everyone's familiar with the mashal that Nathan tells David? Yeah, with the shepherd.
So what does the mashal teach us about the characters represented? Everybody remembers the mashal?
I'm not familiar with it.
So basically, Nathan asked David, there's a rich guy who has everything, and there's a poor guy in town who has 1 sheep. And the rich guy decides for his festive meal, he'll take the sheep of the poor guy.
And of course, David.
And David gets very, yeah, so David gets very angry and says, that man is worthy of death. And Nathan says, that's you. And then David doesn't.
Which is even more problematic because as soon as the king renders a punishment of death, that's supposed to happen right away. And David was giving it to himself.
Right. Well, he can't commit suicide. That was saved for Saul. But it's interesting whether the king can actually command himself today.
I'm going to circle back and answer question 2 by answering question number 1.
Okay.
That I think that it teaches us about Nathan's role as a prophet, and that he was able to have a conversation between this holy shed space and someone on earth by personalizing it and differentiating it. And he had to use that sort of parable in the shop to like help David understand his own actions. And so I think that it teaches us a lot about the characters, like David's comprehension level of his own actions, his ability to self-reflect, him needing sort of like that exterior support, but also about Nathan's skill as a prophet, because it wasn't just about the conversation up, it was about the conversation out, right? And he was able to do that in a way that didn't leave him dead.
How convenient for us.
Yes, how convenient.
Can I just ask a real question?
Sure.
How would you reach the student who needs enrichment? He's like, I've known this story since I'm 8. I'm in 12th grade. What's here for me?
So that's a difficult question, but the people that need enrichment in my school have someone to work with them. And so they would read the story with that person, and that person would help them answer the questions. So it doesn't necessarily do anything in the classroom. You know, I don't necessarily.
Part of the circle, like.
Yeah, well, that was the kid who didn't speak the first time was someone who works with someone in the resource room quite often.
Because they're doing more in depth.
Because he was a weak student who needed a lot of help. You know, he needed a lot of scaffolding that couldn't necessarily be provided in the classroom with 19 other kids.
So this is the other way around. This is where you have a strong student. What would you do with them?
These are questions. I think.
Unless be a leader.
I think actually the leader role, and I know we're all in the same building and people asking questions, but actually the leader role is great because they have the knowledge of the story, so they can ask harder questions and can really, like, I am going to be completely honest, like I am lost in part of our conversation, right? But having a leader of the conversation, you can say, well, actually, there's this other commentary that brings this in that is in contradiction of your point, and giving them that ownership and that power of all of their.
So they would, if they knew in advance, they could go back and
Right,
say,
so the
oh,
other thing is, this was given as a homework assignment,
Uh-huh.
and they had to submit in writing. So you could always ask the kid, let me see what you have, and how can I help you with this, so that you have something to contribute in class.
When you go to the third question about whether sins of leaders should be able to render them unable to govern, do you start asking them to extrapolate to the real world at that point?
Not necessarily. I always encourage it. You know, we live in the 21st century. I tend not to shy away from talking about politics in the classroom. It's not with universal approval, but you know, you have to. They're living in this country. They have to know what's going on, and that there are different views of what's going on. And whatever your view, you have to be able to defend your own view and listen to someone else's view that you disagree with. You know, that's part of growing up, I think.
Just commenting on what you guys were speaking about, it seems like this is the place where there's an interplay between personalized learning or what you're trying to gain as an individual and how you fit into the world of the group. And so you may realize that you need the leader in order to understand what's going on. It's not necessarily impacting your understanding of the content, but it's understanding where you are and what you need, I guess.
And the other piece of it is, I come from a school where the students voted for Trump in 2016, quite surprisingly, but the faculty not so much. But those people would say that there are sins that render you unable to govern, but they might not necessarily say that about David. And so that provides an interesting contrast. Why would we think that David could sin? And it's a pretty dramatic sin. It's hard to dress it up, despite what the rabbis do in the Gemara, and say that you're now fit to govern. So it so it helps them process our text as well. How do we look at our biblical heroes, and what do they have to really teach us about our heroes or anti-heroes today? So, there are no absolute answers to any of the questions, and that's part of the design with these questions. Yes?
I also think the questions that you're asking as you went through are essential questions. Like, there are questions that are interesting for us to have a conversation about, and like, she brought in Gemara. That was like her way of like she's an advanced learner in this topic, where we might have a general studies teacher in here who joined a Jewish day school for the very first time ever, and I'm using wording because she's my teacher, who like that's not, like she's actually going to ask me at the end, what's the
in their
difference?
seat and not like, oh, whatever, I could take the test 2 weeks from
Yeah,
now,
so
I'll be fine.
The type of
what
question,
would you motivate?
so I think it's the type of question. The essential question is a question that doesn't have a yes or no answer, and there's many different ways to answer that question, but having to evidence why you answered that question. She might answer the question about David very differently. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but she might say, no, Gemara doesn't do this or that. Where a person who's just reading the text for the first time might come up with a very different answer and base it on something else. So I think that the type of question asked, because again, those would be, I bet you that some of us could sit at lunch and have a really interesting dialogue about those questions. Regardless of where we're from, if we all had read this, and had our time to process it, and had our time to reflect on the question, I think we could have come in with really interesting, and also knowing that you're going into a Socratic circle or a fishbowl, they know that.
Right.
He's setting that as a norm.
I just wanted to add that the student who's willing to dismiss it still has to participate.
Yeah.
So that's the hook for that person, that no one gets out by saying either I don't know it or I know it too well to have anything to say to anyone else. Everyone has to participate. Now I think we're almost out of time. So I lost the screen. So the last sheet, or slide I guess it's called, has the resources. So any of the things I mentioned, I used, some of it was BetterLesson and some of it was the web. So you're welcome to look at these things if you have any questions about them.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.